Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the Asia Global Institute. My name is Wei Tang. I'm the director of the Institute. This is the first in-person seminar of this year. And I'm so glad to have my good friend, my mentor, my research supervisor from many years ago at MIT to come to Hong Kong to help us kickstart the new seminar series this year. So a few words about Yasheng, and he really needs no introduction. I guess like everyone here came because you must be either related to him as colleagues or friends, or had read many of his wonderful books. So Yasheng actually, well, first of all, obviously he's a professor at MIT Sloan School, has been associate dean at the Sloan School for a few years. Previously, he was at Harvard Business School, and I met him when I was still at Harvard. I don't know if you remember. And at that time, he told me, well, you're from MIT, that's wonderful, because I'm going to join MIT Sloan School next month. That was the time when I met him in 2003, I remember. And since I've been working with him, first as a research assistant, and later on we co-authored some papers. Some were published, some failed and never finished. But on the book side, he has been doing a lot better. I was his RA for a very well-known book called Capitalism with Chinese Characteristics. If there are any mistakes in the data, it must be me, not him. But anyhow, whatever data that I provided to him, he interpreted much more interesting and insightful stories to tell how China grew until essentially 2008. I'm going to ask you a few questions about the Shanghai model later. But after that success, another success obviously is a book that just came out last year, which is called The Rise and Fall of the East. And the East doesn't refer to the traditional meaning, which is the Orient. It's actually an acronym for exams, autocracy, I try to get it right. S is stability and technology. So basically, Yasheng used that framework to think about the interplay between the four components to understand the rise and fall of China in the last 2,000 years. 2 years ago, he gave the first online seminar for us, which kicked off our online seminar series. And I remember at that time, the book was still in the manuscript stage. And Yasheng talked about the history of China. And today, he said he's not going to repeat the history. He's going to talk about the current situation of China. So therefore, the title of the talk is called The Long March of Chinese Reforms, Politics to and from Economics. So I should stop here, and without further ado, please welcome my distinguished guest, Yasheng.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Wei, for that kind and generous introduction. And some of you may know about sort of the Cambridge intellectual environment. It was extraordinarily a good place for academics to work on ideas and all of that. Recently, of course, there's a lot of controversy about both Harvard and MIT, and about DEI and all of that. This is kind of American academia is at a point where it has to make a decision whether or not the free speech, freedom of speech, should be the highest value, or some other political objective. And but that's a different discussion. I'll be happy to talk about that if there's interest. It's also a great privilege for me and great pleasure for me to see so many friends and also some former students. And also, it's great for me to come back to Hong Kong U again. I came here before to give lectures, and then also gave a lecture on Zoom. And I'm extremely happy to be able to give this lecture in person. So let me quickly move to the topic of my presentation. how much time do I have? What?
So for the presentation, 40 minutes.
Okay.
Q&A, half an hour.
Okay, all right. So this is on the contemporary China, basically China since 1978. And the title is about how the Chinese state moved from a very political era to an economic era. And that movement was a key success factor behind the rise of China as an economy and also as a technological superpower. My view is that China is now moving in the opposite direction, away from economics and again embracing politics. And I'm going to go through that, why that happened and how that happened. But my own view is, and I'm going to make it very clear in my presentation, that process began to happen a long time ago rather than just in the last 10 years. In the last 10 years, it has been more direct, explicit movement, but the potential to make the movement away from economics toward politics has been there for a long, long period of time. So I'm going to go through that logic. It's going to be based on my 2003 book, The Rise and the Fall of the East. As Hei explained, the title is not geography. It's about 4 topics in Chinese history and today. I'm also revising my 2008 book. The revision is already finished. I'm going to change the title. The title is Statism with Chinese Characteristics, because I think it's debatable whether today China is still capitalistic. So let me sort of introduce the outline of my 2023 book. It has 4 large topics, starting with exam. And exam is really the Keju system, right, which China established in the 6th century. And the basic idea of the book is that the Keju system anchored the Chinese political and thereby economic and social and intellectual developments. And we still see the influence of the Keju system in today's China. And the second topic is on autocracy. And the idea there is, why is it that we have a failure of emergence of a different type of system in the long history of China? The third part is about stability. It's a remarkably stable system, right? The imperial system is very stable. If you contrast that with Europe, it's just amazing stability. And I'm now writing another book with a co-author of mine, Claire Yang, and we contrast the Chinese political development since 6th century with European political development. And we have some data to show that the 2 regions are very, very different. And then technology. So there's a famous claim in the study of economic history, what is known as a Needham question. Why is it that China, with a lead in technology, later on failed to industrialize? And then I also talk about Chinese successes in the recent 30 years and why technology and entrepreneurship, high-tech entrepreneurship developed. And then I'm going to speculate about the future. So the last 2 chapters are more speculative. So they're very broad, and unlike some books that also trace today's China to history, I don't write a book in a chronological sequence. So I have 1 chapter on history, another chapter on contemporary China, 1 chapter on history, another chapter on contemporary China. And the 4 big topics are exam, autocracy, stability and technology, how they have interacted with each other and how they have shaped Chinese economy and Chinese society. I want to be descriptive, analytical, and to some extent prescriptive. I don't want to bring in values, right? So value judgments, ideology. And the intention is to learn from Chinese history rather than from theories. And I think in today's China, it is still possible to have a discussion purely based on Chinese data, Chinese facts. I mean, once you introduce Western ideas and then people criticize you for contaminating China. But if the claim is based on Chinese own history, you cannot possibly make that argument against the findings. So I don't, I don't impose values, but I want to say that the data and the Chinese empirics show, at least on the technology front, there's no China unique model. China succeeded in a way that Europe succeeded, and China failed in a way that other civilizations failed. And the basic, since I'm not going to talk about history today, so I'm going to talk a little bit here now, that when China began to lose its inventiveness, that was precisely when China became more autocratic. When ideology was reduced to one ideology, when the political system became more centralized, and precisely at the time when Europe was moving in the opposite direction, right? So Europe, after the collapse of Roman Empire, became fragmented, became more unstable, actually. The wars and the conflicts and the rebellions, the separation between the church and the state. Whereas in China, the politics became more centralized. There was a failure of the emergence of an independent church. There was a failure of the emergence of independent intellectual society, because culture system essentially monopolized the human capital, right? So in our data, we show clearly the correlation, and maybe not the causation, the correlation between when China moved in that direction and the decline in Chinese inventiveness. And so I want to just basically say that you're going to pay a price if you want to make your system, you're going to pay a technological price if you want to move the system toward more autocracy. So I'm going to focus on China since 1978, and I'm going to make the following points. One is that politics and economics are not substitutes, but they are complements. Right? So the basic idea there is that when you see more liberal politics in China, you also see more liberal economics. Right? When I say liberal economics, I mean marketization, privatization, globalization, and things like that. Liberal politics, I mean not constitutional democracy, but at least more tolerant political space and more fragmentation of the political structure, right? So when you have more of that, you have more of economic reforms. And as I said before, I think the seed of China going back to a more centralized political system went back to 1989. I saw 1989 as the true turning point. Right? So this is long before 2013. And then I'm going to talk about GDP. So as many of you know, that under Deng Xiaoping, GDP was the highest objective function of the Chinese state. And obviously it's important because of economic growth, but it's actually the importance of GDP is beyond economic growth. My argument is that when you emphasize GDP, you are in effect reducing the power of the government, right? Reducing the discretionary power of the Chinese state, because GDP is a function of government policies for sure, but also, there are things like capital labor ratios, the US economy, and Southeast Asia, Europe. These are beyond the control of the government leader, right? And so when you emphasize GDP, you kind of have to take these things as a given. Whereas when you emphasize politics, everything is under your control, right? So that's the fundamental difference between an economic objective function and the political objective function, right? When you have a political objective function, it vastly expands the discretionary power of the state. When you have an economic objective function, it doesn't make the state go away for sure, right? We all know how powerful Chinese state is in economic development, but at least it puts some upper limits on the power of the state. And then I'm going to end on the current economic situation. So this is beyond my 2023 book, and I talk about this in my forthcoming book. There's a famous view put out by Adam Poulsen, who's the head of the Peterson Institute of International Economics, and he argues that the reason why Chinese economy now is not recovering from the COVID is China is suffering from a long economic COVID. So I'm going to talk about that perspective. And then just speculate about the prospects, okay? So let me start with the reform. Hey, can I have some water? Yeah. Sorry. Let me start with the discussion on the reform era by talking about a tale of two communiques, right? One was the 1978 Third Plenum communique, very famous communique, 1978. And the other is, also famous, 2013, thank you, Third Plenum communique, right? The two communiques are actually similar in terms of their emphasis on reforms, and the 1978 communique was viewed as a path-breaking communique that started Chinese economic reforms. But there was a lot of optimism about 2013 communique as well, because that communique was actually very detailed about the reform measures and steps, and it showed the determination of the reforms, right? So there's no, I hope everybody is familiar with the 1978 Third Plenum communique. There's no controversy, there's no dispute. That communique launched Chinese reforms, right? Agricultural reforms, first agricultural reforms, and then the agricultural reforms in turn created momentum for globalization and urban reforms. And it was unquestionably, in my view, at the heart of Chinese economic miracle, right? And Hua Guofeng was kind of edged out, and Deng Xiaoping took over. The 2013 communique, despite the optimism at the time, and I don't really see any visible effects in terms of the reforms from the 2013 communique, right? Even though it was a declaration of reforms, right? What has happened, as you know, in Hong Kong, is the intensification of politics, right? Anti-corruption campaign, all of that. And then, we have a moderation of economic growth, and now there's even worry about, moderation going beyond moderation, maybe even stagnation. So the two documents produce totally different outcomes, despite their superficial similarities. So what happened? Right? So if you look at the 1978 communique, it was very interesting. It was a political document to end politics. Right? So it was actually a very political document. It was, most of the issues discussed in that document are about politics, about Cultural Revolution, Great Leap Forward, anti-racist campaign. And then the leadership used that political discussion as a justification to move to an economic agenda, right? So, if I can simplify, what the document said is, look at all these horrible things that happened before in Chinese politics. Let's move beyond that, and then let's embrace an economic agenda. And it was another characteristic about that document is that it was very frank. It said, our economy is in a terrible shape. Stagnation, income stagnation, and really, really compared with other countries, and we're struggling, right? So it was an open acknowledgement of the challenges faced by China. So they used that to emphasize the urgency of the reforms. Right? The other characteristic is that the document empowered local governments and indirectly entrepreneurs. So it didn't say the central government is going to do A, B, C, D, E, F, G. It said, well, the central government is kind of want to move on, but we don't really know what to do, so it's up to you what to do, right? Basically, I'm exaggerating, but that's kind of the essence of that document. So it empowered the local agents, right? There was a lot of operating space. So we all know the famous saying by Deng, right? To catch the mice, doesn't matter whether it's black and white. Before, so you may think, oh, what's the big deal about that statement? It's actually quite profound because it's very pragmatic. It's also, think about this, right? So it's also experimental, right? You choose policies on the basis of the results rather than on the basis of ideological priors. Right? That's actually incredibly profound. Well, 2013 document, so what it did was it moved from a single objective function, economic growth, economic reforms, to multiple objective functions. So, I teach at business school, so I know enough about organizational economics to know that when a company pursues multiple objectives, it usually confuses the management rather than clarifying the practice, right? So it's much more difficult when a company pursues multiple objectives. Government typically pursues multiple objectives, especially in a democracy, they have to, right? But the key thing for China is that because there's such a strong urge to pursue political objective, right? The history of the Chinese Communist Party is all about politics, right? Mao and Lin Biao and all of that. The urge to pursue politics is so strong, you kind of have to say, we only pursue one objective, which is economic growth, to offset against the importance of the political objective, because the gravitational pull of politics is so strong, you have to go very strongly in the opposite direction to make sure that the Chinese state doesn't go in that direction. But the 2013 document complicated the situation by introducing multiple objectives. One of them is national security. And then the other feature of the 2013 document is that there's more discussion of the methods rather than the goals, right? Capital market reforms, ownership reforms, taxation reforms, very detailed. And that's why the document impressed so many economists at the time. Because economists look at this, wow, this looks like textbook recommendations, right? Market-based and leveling the playing field. Those are actually very market-oriented principles and methods. But there's very little in the document about why you do these things, right? What problems, in business school, we often ask our students, because our students sometimes are more interested in solutions than analyzing the problems. So we always ask, what does your proposed solution, what problem does your proposed solution solve? There's very little in that document about the problems, right? All the kind of imbalances of the Chinese economy, the income disparity, and I would argue that the rural Chinese situation, I don't know if anybody in the room has read a book by Scott Rozelle and Natalie Hell, Invisible China. The lack of human capital investments in rural China is just unbelievable, right? But you don't get any of that in this document. So it's about methods, it's about solutions, rather than about the problems. It is more about empowering the central government, right? So it talks about reforms as being coordinated and organized by the central leadership. And this is a very, Hey Wai would know, right? So in organization, in economics, we talk about how different elements work to reinforce each other, right? The best way to reform is what is known as endogenous reforms. You do A, and that A leads to B, and then the B leads to C, right? So that's exactly what happened in China in the 1980s. Agricultural reforms leading to urban reforms leading to globalization. But here it's about doing everything, right? Capital market reforms, and so there's more of a design built into the document, and the designer is the central government. So it is taking the agency away from local governments and entrepreneurs. I would argue that the history of Chinese reforms shows that the reforms happen exactly in the opposite way from the one that was prescribed in the 2013 document. It is bottom up, and it is not about the wisdom of the central leadership. It is really about the central leadership creating space for experimentation, for trials and errors. If you read Deng Xiaoping's speeches, he talked all the time about, let's just see what happens, right? Let's see, if it is going to work. If it doesn't work, we don't try it anymore. It's really just trial and error, right? Rather than a central kind of vision imposed on local governments. Right, so local agency, local governments and entrepreneurs, a lot of the times the central government came later to recognize what happened on the ground, right? Shenzhen, it happened not in the way that the central government thought it was going to happen. In fact, if you read Ezra Vogel spoke about Deng Xiaoping, the leaders of Guangdong in the 1980s were often called to Beijing and criticized by Chen Yun. Right? How come you're doing this? This is not within the central government's authority. And so the Guangdong officials, obviously, they listened, but then they went back to Guangdong and do exactly the same thing, right? So that's really how Chinese reforms happened. You actually, and there's a fundamental difference between waiting for the central government approval, and there's a difference between that and doing things on the ground already to create a reality on the ground. For the central government to reverse the reality on the ground is much more difficult than for the central government to reverse a proposal, right? I mean, there's a fundamental difference between the two. Even though Chen Yun wanted to reverse the situation, it would be very, very difficult because, things were already happened, maybe the hotel was already built, right? So you can't really undo these things on the ground. So that's why the experimental approach is the right approach. So as I said, central government provided exposed sanctions rather than ex ante permissions, and then a single objective function on economics. So the idea is that, okay, politics, we talk about politics in 1978, Great Leap Forward, Cultural Revolution, and all of that. Let's just move on. Let's just move on. And in the 1980s, I believe, China represented that model the best. Later on also, but 1980s is a more pure example of illustration of that model. In my own view, and maybe because I was a young person in 1980s, 1980s is my favorite decade. And it's a remarkable decade. A lot of young people actually know nothing about 1980s. And some don't even know who Yaobang was, who Yaobang. And Zhao Ziyang. In my view, they rank, maybe the same as Deng Xiaoping. They are just remarkable individuals who created the China miracle. So in 1980s, the politics became gentle, and the political competition is rivalry rather than political struggles. So there's no longer life and death politics, right? So think about Cultural Revolution, think about what happened to Lin Biao, what happened to Liu Shaoqi. So essentially the elites, the political elites in the 1980s agreed to live and let live, okay? And Hua Guofeng lost power, Hu Yaobang lost power, but both of them retained the membership in the Central Committee. And in fact, Hua Guofeng was, before he died, he was the longest serving member of the Central Committee, longest ever in the history of Central Committee. Hu Yaobang was edged out as the party secretary, but he retained the membership of the Politburo. He could still participate in Politburo meetings, and he still could provide opinions. So they were not, charged with corruption and put in jail, right? They decriminalized political conduct. That really matters, right? And there's no politicization of corruption issue. There was a political fragmentation, and a lot of people, I think, didn't know that. In the 1970s, China didn't have, separation of power, Congress, judiciary, and the executive branch. Definitely, China didn't have institutional separation of power. But the minimum condition for separation of power is separation among individuals, right? The 5 power centers in China in the 1980s were headed by 5 different individuals, right? The general secretary was Zhao Ziyang. The presidency, 国家主席, was Li Xiannian. Central Military Commission was Zheng Xiaoping. Premier Li Peng. Central Advisory Commission, 中顾委, was headed by Chen Yun. 5 different individuals headed 5 different power centers, right? And that was really, I mean, I didn't quite think about this issue before, but as I'm revising my book, I really think this is fundamentally different from the situation later on. I'm going to show you what happened later. There was also substantial political reforms. I don't know how many people in the room know, in the 1980s, Zhongnanhai was open to the public. Did anybody know this? Okay, so some people may know. It was open to the public, right? And Zhao Ziyang and Hu Yaobang instituted separation of the party from the management of the SOEs. In 1988, they began to separate the party branches from Chinese ministries, central government ministries. Right? If you read People's Daily at the time, in the 1980s, it is fascinating. They would have 2 editorials side by side. One says A is the right thing to do. The other says A is the wrong thing to do. Right? This is People's Daily. Competing voices, right? You know, there's no way you get that today. Intellectuals criticize Deng Xiaoping by name. You know, Fang Lizhi and Liu Binyan, they criticized, I mean, in the end, they kind of had to leave China. So, not for long, but for a long time, they could do it. There were several political campaigns, right? Anti-spiritual pollution campaign and anti-bourgeois campaign. But they were only like several months. What's also remarkable is, look at anti-corruption campaign is still going on, 10 years. In the anti-spiritual pollution campaign, the Ministry of Agriculture came out and said, well, this is anti-spiritual since agriculture is not about spirit. We don't care. And then another agency said, oh, okay, I think we agree with Ministry of Agriculture. This is not really our stuff. And they were only like lasting for a few months, 2 months, 3 months. It was just remarkable, right? I mean, I think 1980s is really, I mean, in the future, I want to write a whole book about 1980s. It's a fascinating period. In maybe 1988, but or 1989, Zhao Ziyang proposed asset disclosure of the Politburo members. Right? Just imagine if they did that, whether or not corruption would have been so problematic. Economic reforms in the 1980s were decentralized and bottom-up. The township and village enterprises in 1984, there were 12 million of them. Of these, 10 million are purely private. There was substantial rural financial reform, and so I talk about that in my 2008 book. And since 2008, Mei Juan Qian and I, who is she is a professor of economics at Australian National University, we had done statistical analysis comparing access to finance in the 1980s with the access to finance in the 1990s. The access to finance in rural China in 1980 was much better than access to finance in 1990s, right? So there was substantial rural financial reforms. nationwide in scale, so this is a Rural Credit Foundation, purely private, nationwide in scale. Okay. There was a golden era of Chinese economic development. GDP was very fast, so usually until recently you can just say Chinese GDP has always been very fast. But several features of the 1980s stand out. One is that the personal income growth exceeded GDP growth. So if you think about the economy, three sectors, right? Government, business, and household sector. The household sector share of the GDP was rising in the 1980s because the household income growth exceeded the GDP growth, right? Gini coefficient actually fell, right? Mostly because of the rise of the rural income. The biggest contributor to the income inequality in Chinese economy is the disparity between urban and rural areas. And because rural area was growing so fast, the Gini coefficient actually fell. Growth was driven by domestic demand. China didn't, have an export-driven strategy. China actually had an overvalued exchange rate. China had, out of the 10 years in 1980s, 11 years, 1980s, only in 3 years, China had a trade account or current account surpluses. Right? So it wasn't a mercantilistic growth at all. It was really purely domestic-driven, consumption-driven growth pattern. Private consumption, household consumption GDP ratio around 50%, the highest in the last 45 years, easily the highest. Now it's about 40%, right? The lowest was 2010, only 34%, right? Very, very low, right? So Chinese growth in the 1980s, I would argue, fast GDP growth, higher income growth for the households, more balanced growth drivers, less reliant on external economy. In a way, that's what we expect for a continental economy. Unlike Singapore, for a continental economy, you actually shouldn't have such a high current account surpluses as a percentage share of the GDP. And China, at that time, was like that. Okay, so I would argue Tiananmen was the turning point. So what happened? And the economic reforms continued, but mostly in the urban area and globalization. Rural reforms were not moving forward. Rural financial reforms were actually reversed in the 1990s. When you have kind of urban private sector development under strong state power, the fundamental difference between urban China and rural China is that in urban China, the power of the state is just incredible. In rural China, the power of state is less, right? So when you have capitalism in rural China, by definition, is more entrepreneurial than the kind of capitalism in urban China. And then when you have a more connected private sector development, you also have corruption, right? And then at the political level, there was a re-centralization of power away from the 5 power center situation in the 1980s into basically 2 power centers, the party secretary and the premier. That's about it. So by the way, in the immediately after 1989, Zhongnanhai was closed again. Okay? And 5 centers of power collapsed into 2. All the political reforms proposed by Hu Yaobang and Zhao Ziyang were reversed. Every single one of them was reversed. The Central Advisory Committee was abolished. I'm going to come back to that. I believe that actually was a very important development. So if you look at, this is 1992, right? Remember in the 1980s, there were 5 individuals. In the 1990s, there were only 2 individuals. Jiang Zemin, the party secretary, the military affairs commission, the president of the state, and Li Peng, the premier. And then the Central Advisor Commission was abolished. Right? So it became much more centralized and streamlined political structure. So we did a data analysis of the names of top Chinese leaders mentioned in the People's Daily editorials. So here's the hypothesis, right? So when multiple leaders are mentioned, that means it's a more distributed power structure, right? When only one leader is mentioned without mentioning anybody else, that's a more concentrated, right? So that's 1980s. The number of the times the party secretary name is mentioned. Very low, right? As compared with the mentions of other leaders, right? Here and here. 1990s, the party secretary, this is Jiang Zemin, and this is Hu Jintao. And you can imagine who that is, right? and all these guys actually all declined to 0. All right, okay. So, so that's that. Corruption. We collected data on the basis of media reports. And, you know, it's not great, but that's as best as we can do. Just in terms of 1980s, 1990s, and this is 2003 to 2022, just kind of an average case value of corruption in the average and median, right? In the 1980s, 120,000 yuan, average case value corruption. Median value is even less, 60,000. And you may say it's not controlling for GDP. Yeah, well, you can control for GDP by dividing these numbers by the GDP. So the ratio is 0.042. Look at 1990s, right? Quadrupled in terms of that. And then another big jump since 2003. The absolute value went from 120,000 yuan to almost 4 million yuan. And then Hu Jintao is 30 million yuan, right? So essentially, the Chinese capitalism became extremely corrupt, which, remember, was the factor that motivated the anti-corruption campaign, right? So I'm going to talk about the Central Advisor Commission, and many people may not remember that commission. My own view is that in a one-party system, the only realistic check on a leader is the previous leaders, right? We don't have much control. I don't think Ma Yun had much control, or Cai Jing or Cai Xin, right? Nobody, but the previous leaders have some power. The Central Advisory Commission was an institutionalized mechanism for the previous leaders to exercise some influence on the current leaders. Now you abolish that, you get rid of an institutional mechanism for the previous leaders to exercise some control over the current leaders. It doesn't mean to say that the previous leaders didn't exercise that control. They did, right? Jiang Zemin famously exercised a lot of control over Hu Jintao. But you could only do that as an individual leader rather than as an institution. When you do it as an individual, then you are subject to all the biological features of an individual. You're getting old, you're getting sick. It's not as effective and permanent as an institutional check and balance. So I use that logic to explain why the 2000 2018 constitutional revision was so easy, right? I think everybody understands what I'm talking about. So let me move on. And the fact that I have to say that is really, it's kind of my story, right? So the counterfactual question is, if the Central Advisory Commission still existed, I don't think the political changes that have happened in China in the last 10 years would have been as easy. They may still happen, but they may not have happened so easily. Okay, so that's my bottom line. We can have a discussion of that. Okay, so let me move on quickly to GDP targeting. I already said why GDP targeting is important, because economic growth. But the most important thing about GDP targeting is that it devalues politics, right? And so if we quote from Hobbes, right, the Chinese politics is nasty, short, and brutish. So anything moving away from that is a welfare plus, right? Welfare improvement. And now we have sort of pivot from economics and politics because of lack of institutional mechanism to check the power of the individuals. And you actually see a lot of the evidence of the declining importance of economic growth relative to other objective functions, national security and party control, ideological control, right? So I'm not saying economic growth is not important. It's just that on top of that, you introduce all these other objective functions. So then the local leaders can pick and choose which ones they want to maximize. And let me tell you, in a political system such as China, it's always safer to choose the political objective because when you choose the economic objective, it will require you to work with private entrepreneurs and foreign investors, and that's politically problematic. Right? So the returns on politics are being enhanced. So now you see this great kind of investments in political human capital, right? Singing the praises and doing all these things. The recent one was in a Ganzhou place, in Guangxi, so now the people are worshiping the field where the leader visited. It's just remarkable, right? And how a country changed so quickly. So let me end by talking about why we don't see this strong rebound of the economy after COVID, because the expectation was, China always has great economic growth, and with the COVID control, once you lift the COVID control, you can observe a rebound. That didn't happen. So Adam Posen wrote a famous article in Foreign Affairs talking about the end of China's economic miracle. So he argued it was a long economic COVID. I would argue that it is a long political COVID. So what has happened, and also it's beyond the COVID control, beyond 2022. When you say economic long COVID, it's really because of COVID. When you say political COVID, then it is really something that has happened even before 2022. What happened is that, and this is my timeline, the anti-corruption campaign basically undermined the incentives of local officials starting from 2013 to 2018, right? So again, the economy has three sectors: government, business, and household. So the government, and mostly local, in China it's local governments that drive GDP growth. Between 2013 and 2018, when you had this strong anti-corruption campaign, the incentive of the local officials was undermined, right? I mean, unfortunately, in that type of political system, the incentive basically is provided by corruption, right? So the local officials approve projects because they get some money out of that approval. And then so there's a phrase called 懒政. So if you trace that phrase began to emerge in 2017, 2018. So of the three sectors of the Chinese economy, the government sector was affected the first. Now there's this phrase, 躺平, right? I mean, 懒政 is essentially the political version of 躺平. 躺平 refers to the young people and to the households, right? But the government sector had that 躺平 many years ago under the anti-corruption campaign. The business sector, the anti-corruption campaign definitely was a shock, right? So think about the business on the supply side of the corruption, the government on the demand side of the corruption. When you undermine the supply, or you undermine the demand, you also undermine the supply. But that was the initial shock, right? And then there were additional shocks, and these are all familiar to everybody here. The cancellation of the IPO of Ant Financial, 2020, and then 2022, just a series of crackdowns on businesses, gaming, private education, ride-hailing, right? So essentially sort of, from 2018 to 2022, the business sector confidence was undermined. And then the household sector. And that was the zero COVID controls, right? So that's kind of final straw that undermined the household sector. So that's my way of explaining why the rebound was so difficult. I mean, if only the government sector was affected, you could still have the strong household sector, you can still have the strong business sector. When you undermine the household sector, that is a very powerful negative, right? Because household sector is big, right? There are more Chinese people than there are Chinese business people. And then the household sector, once the psychology is such, right? So once the psychology is set, it's very difficult to get the people to move away from that psychology. So in my own view, there's still time. There's still time for the government to correct the situation, maybe to first work on the household sector. There's still time, but they need to act very, very fast. Okay, so let me end by saying that I'm happy that now I think there's some policy adjustments, right? Mostly on the foreign policy front, right? Xi Jinping and Biden met in San Francisco, which is a very good development. But I think that was to solve one specific problem, which is the overproduction problem through the final demand, right? External demand, not also final demand, but the external portion of the final demand, essentially the easing the trade tensions with the outside world, right? So if you look at Chinese exports to the United States, as a share of US imports from the rest of the world, since 2018, the Chinese share has declined from 21% to 15%. That 6 percentage point decline, roughly 2%, 4% went to Canada and Mexico, and 2% went to Vietnam. So 2% of the US shares of global imports. So the US imports about $3.2 trillion, right? 2 percentage point of 3.2 US imports went to Vietnam. Vietnam is a poor country. The GDP is about 300 billion. Within 6 years, you get this gift of 2 percentage points of the US global imports to Vietnam, right? It's just a remarkable loss on the part of China and the gain on the part of Vietnam. So the repairing the relationship with the US, with Europe, I think is a good move, but it is really just solving that particular problem. To solve the supply side problems, right? Household sector, housing sector, overcapacity, and the internal final demand, household consumption as a share of the GDP. I think you need to do more than having a summit with President Biden or, God forbid, Donald Trump. And so in terms of imbalances, we can have a discussion about that. You really, I think the fundamental issue in terms of Chinese economic imbalances is that you need to put the money in people rather than in things, rather than in airports, railway, highways. You need to put money in people. So far, I don't see evidence. That's the direction of the thinking in the policy making. In terms of restoring the confidence of local officials, business, household sectors, the question there is, if you don't want to go back to the 1978 model, can you really do it? If you don't introduce political reforms, rule of law, can you do it, right? And with the current kind of national security imperative, I'm not sure you can do that, right? So I think the recent policy adjustments are good, but I believe to really, really change the picture, you need to do these other things. Thank you very much.
This is wonderful. I think we can go on forever, but we are already severely overrun. I don't want to summarize because I don't have time, so thank you so much once again, Professor Huang, for giving this wonderful lecture.